Welcome to Chromaticus. Today we're going to cover 3 easy ways to write more unique chord progressions. If you find that your chord progressions are getting really boring and stale, and you run out of ideas quickly, or maybe you're new to writing music altogether, then the 3 types of chords I'm about to show you will instantly help you write more interesting chord progressions. The 3 types we're going to talk about are secondary dominants, modal interchange chords, and a type of chromatic chord pair known as the Chromatic II V7. And we're going to take a very basic, simple chord progression in the key of C major that looks like this, and by the end we're going to have something that looks like this, which uses all 3 types of chords that we're going to talk about. If this all sounds incredibly daunting, don't worry, I am going to walk you through it step by step and make it really easy to understand even if you're a beginner. So we're starting with this very plain, very simple chord progression. It's diatonic, which means it stays in the key of C major the whole time, and the harmonic rhythm is 1 chord per measure, and that also stays static the entire time. Let's take a listen. Now, there's nothing wrong with this progression, and there's nothing wrong with staying diatonic the whole time, but you're not going to want to do that with every single song that you write. So let's get a little more adventurous. The first type of chord that you can add to spice up this progression is called a secondary dominant chord. Let's take a look at the options that we have in the key of C major. If you're in the key of C major, the G dominant 7 chord is the 5 chord, which is the primary dominant chord that resolves down a perfect fifth to the 1 chord. And it's really common to see a dominant chord paired with the 2 chord for a 2-5-1 progression. So D minor 7, G7 is the 2-5 of the 1 chord. Secondary dominant chords are dominant chords that precede the other diatonic chords in the key. They can be found a perfect fifth above the target chord. So if your target chord is the 2 chord, this D minor 7, a perfect fifth above that would be an A dominant 7 chord. Also, whenever you play the 5 chord of any of these chords, you can also include its related 2 chord. So the 2-5 of this 2 chord would be E minor 7 flat 5 and A dominant 7. You don't have to be in the key of D minor to play the 2-5 that resolves to the D minor 7 chord. At this point, you might be thinking, if I play a 2-5 of D minor, doesn't that mean that I've modulated it into the key of D minor? No. And in fact, you're strengthening the key of C major by using secondary dominant chords to tonicize the other diatonic chords in the key. It sort of makes the foundations of those diatonic chords in C major stronger, so to speak. In order for your ear to hear modulation into the key of D minor, it would take time. If I played the progression 2-5-1 of that D minor chord, and then I started using B flats instead of B naturals in the melody, and I never returned to C major, it would eventually convince your ear that the modulation has taken place. But it does take time and some effort on the composer's part for that oral shift to actually happen. Here are the other secondary dominant chords and their related 2 chords for the other diatonic chords in C major. You can play the 2-5 of the 3 chord, the 2-5 of the 4 chord, the 2-5 of the 5 chord, and the 2-5 of the 6 chord. The only chord you won't typically see a 2-5 pair for is the 7 chord, which in this case is B minor 7 flat 5. The reason is because a diminished chord is unstable, and therefore a dominant chord doesn't really resolve to this chord because a dominant chord really needs a stable chord to resolve to, such as a major or minor chord. Technically, there is nothing stopping you from resolving a 2-5 chord here, it's just not something that composers usually do. But you can use 2-5s for any of these other chords in the key. Now let's apply this concept to our progression. In this example, you can see that I used the 2-5 of the 2 chord. And I've also shortened the harmonic rhythm of the 2 chord so that I can add in the 5 chord and have a 2-5 of the 1 chord. This gives us a nice resolution to the 1 chord in bar 5. Now I could have put the 2-5 anywhere. I could have done 2-5 of the 4 chord, the 2-5 of the 6 chord. It's really up to you how often you want to use these and how complex you want to make the music. Now let's take a listen to what our progression sounds like with the added secondary dominant chord. Quick side note, whenever you have a dominant 7 flat 9 chord, you can substitute it with a diminished chord. And you do this by simply removing the root of the chord, which in this case would give us a C sharp diminished 7th chord, which still resolves with dominant function to the 2 chord. This is just another possible option to think about. I have a whole episode dedicated to diminished chords, and there's a link in the description to that episode, so if you want to learn all about diminished chords, be sure to check that out. The second type of chord we're going to examine today is called a modal interchange chord, and it essentially means that you can borrow chords from basically any other parallel mode. Parallel modes contain the same key center, in this case C is our key center, or tonic, but parallel modes contain different modal degrees. So parallel to C major, you have C natural minor, C melodic minor, harmonic minor, Dorian, Phrygian, Lydian, and so on. And you can borrow chords from these parallel modes to add some nice distinction and color to your music. Let's keep things simple and look at the C natural minor scale. If you compare the C major scale to the C natural minor scale, you'll see that the 1 chord is now a minor 7 chord. The 2 chord is now a minor 7 flat 5 chord instead of a regular minor 7 chord. The next chord is where things start to get really interesting because it's a minor key, which has a flat 3rd degree. So instead of a minor 7 chord on the 3rd degree, you get a major 7 chord on the flat 3rd degree. The 4 chord still has the same root location, but now it's a minor 7 chord. And the same thing for the 5 chord. It's the same root location. It's still G, but it's G minor 7 instead of G dominant. And the next chord, instead of the minor 7 on the 6th degree, you get a major 7 on the flat 6th degree. And the same thing for the last chord. Instead of the minor 7 flat 5 on the 7th degree, you get a dominant 7 chord on the flat 7th degree. In this example, you can see I used an F minor 7 in the 2nd bar instead of the F major 7, and in bar 6 I used an A flat major 7 chord instead of the diatonic A minor 7. Now I chose these chords at random just to demonstrate modal interchange, but when you're writing your own music, the harmonic choices should always be in support of the melody, so you should use discretion for which chords you use and where you put them in the song, rather than just picking them at random. So our new progression sounds like this. The third type of chord we're going to examine today is a certain type of chromatic chord, which is known as the Chromatic II V. A Chromatic II V is essentially just a chromatic sequence of harmony. Our pattern that we're transposing is the 2/5 chord pair, and the transposition we're going to use is down 1/2 step. So if we look at our progression, let's say we want to have a Chromatic II V approaching the diatonic II V in the last bar. If we want to approach this with chromatically descending motion, you simply take this 2/5 pattern and you play it a 1/2 step higher in the previous bar, which in this case would give you an E flat minor 7 and an A flat 7. So when you're using harmonic sequences, it's easier to think of the 2 chords as one single harmonic unit. And you take that unit, E flat minor 7, A flat 7, and you shift it down a 1/2 step to get the D minor 7 and G7. This can be a little tricky to understand, so I'm going to do my best to explain this thoroughly. In order for your brain to actually recognize and hear a pattern as a sequence, you really need 3 or more transpositions of that pattern. So for example, if we look back at our chord progression, if we started with an E minor 7 and A7 and transpose that down to E flat minor 7 and A flat 7, and then again down to D minor 7 and G7, then that would be, in the traditional sense, a harmonic sequence moving down chromatically. In our example, however, I only transposed the 2/5 pattern once, which means on a purely technical level, it's not a sequence. Sometimes it's referred to as a half sequence, or it can be thought of as a temporary displacement of tonality, which then returns back to the tonality of C major in the next bar. Now I also have a 2/5 progression in bar 3, and I could certainly approach that with a Chromatic II V if I wanted to. Again, it's entirely up to you where you use these chords in your music, but you should always be thinking about the melodic implications. Here's what our chord progression sounds like now with the added Chromatic II V. Notice how so far all of the chords in this progression are in root position. At any point as the composer or the arranger, you can put any of these chords in inversions to get a smoother stepwise bass motion that is more unique than always having every chord in root position. There is one more important point that I want to make. In our final example of our chord progression, I use all the types of chords discussed in this lesson as a demonstration. The secondary dominants, the modal interchange chords, and the Chromatic II V. This doesn't mean that you always have to use all these outside chords and make songs super complex. You can take a very basic diatonic progression like the one that we started with and just add one of these chords, like the minor 4 chord instead of the major 4 chord. And it will have a huge impact on how the song sounds and feels without necessarily getting super complex. Simplicity can be really nice sometimes, so don't feel like you have to overdo it all the time. That's going to do it for today. If you enjoyed this episode, please share it with your friends on social media. All right, thanks for watching. See you next time.